Today we're diving into a really intense article by Faroese commentator Óli Breckmann. And what's wild about it is how it starts with a critique of a single academic and then just escalates into this full-blown call for a global ideological war. We're going to break down exactly how he gets from point A to point Z. And look, he sets the tone right from the get-go. I mean, this is the very first line. He's not just describing the person he's critiquing, Sigri Gaini. This is a declaration of war, almost. It immediately tells you this isn't going to be a simple, friendly disagreement. It's personal, it's ideological, and it's confrontational. So here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll look at the initial critique that kicks everything off. Then we'll get into the main accusation, which is anti-Semitism. After that, we'll unpack what he calls the threat of humanism. Check out the stats he uses, see how this all builds into a global battle plan, and finally, we'll cover his big final warning. All right, so the whole thing really kicks off because of a disagreement with this academic, Sigri Gaini. She'd written about mourning the loss of a humanistic Europe, and she's also done work on hate speech. For the author, Óli Breckmann, these aren't just abstract ideas you debate in a classroom. To him, they are a very real political threat. Okay, so his definition of hate speech is super important to understanding his whole argument. He basically says it's not a real thing, but a political weapon. And it has two parts, according to him. First, you just label conservative ideas hate and left-wing ideas love. Simple. But the second part is the real kicker. He believes the ultimate goal is to control what people think. The logic is, if you're not allowed to say something, eventually you won't even be able to think it anymore. All right, now we're getting into what is probably the most serious charge in the entire article. He makes a big pivot here. He goes from talking about hate speech to directly accusing Gaini's entire worldview of being fundamentally anti-Semitic. And the main piece of evidence he uses to back this up? The Israel-Hamas conflict. So to build this case, he lays out his version of the October 7th attack, and his description is, well, it's very graphic and direct. He focuses heavily on the violence against civilians and makes sure to frame it as this massive historic atrocity. This narrative is key because it's the foundation for pretty much every argument he makes from this point forward. And that leads right into his main counter-narrative. He argues that what he calls the common narrative, or the dominant media view, always portrays Palestinians as the victims. From his perspective, this completely ignores the context of who initiated the attack on October 7th. And to really drive this point home, he makes this very specific and pretty provocative claim. He says that the humanitarian aid that's supposed to go to the people in Gaza is actually being stolen by Hamas, who then use it to build up their military infrastructure, like their famous tunnel network. Okay, so now the argument takes a big step back. It zooms out. The author starts connecting all these dots, his critique of this one academic, the conflict in Gaza, and links them to this huge, overarching ideology that he just calls humanism. And he says this is the real reason Europe is in decline. It's interesting because he actually agrees with Gaini on one thing, that Europe is declining, but he totally disagrees on the diagnosis. She says the problem is a lack of humanism. He says no, the problem is humanism itself, which he basically sees as a stand-in for socialism. He argues this whole ideology has just rotted the continent from the inside out, weakening its power and its will to fight. So to back up this idea of a continent in decay, he turns to demographics. He brings up this statistic from Pew Research, the projection that Europe's Muslim population could hit 90 million by 2050. Now, he doesn't present this as just a demographic trend. He frames it as direct proof that humanistic policies are creating a literal existential threat to Europe. And then, to really hammer this point home, he brings in crime statistics. He presents data that, in his view, draws a straight, undeniable line between immigration and a rise in crime. And he zeroes in specifically on Scandinavia to make his case. So let's look at the actual numbers he's using. He claims that in Sweden, a group he identifies as Muslims make up 9% of the population but commit 58% of all crimes. Then he shifts to Denmark, citing data that says crime rates for first-generation immigrant men are 51% higher than from native Danes, and for second-generation men, that number jumps to 149% higher. And this chart here, it visualizes his boldest statistical claim. He's alleging a direct mathematical relationship. For every 1% increase in a country's Muslim population, he says the homicide rate goes up by 3.6%. And it's important to note, he doesn't just present this as a correlation, he presents it as cause and effect. So what's the endgame here? Well, he takes all these different threads, the attack on the academic, the war in Gaza, the crime stats, and he weaves them all together into this massive final conclusion. He basically says that all of modern politics, everything happening in the world, can be boiled down to a global war between two opposing sides. And here's how he breaks it down. It's a pretty clear-cut us versus them scenario. On one side, you have the defenders of the West, Trump, Netanyahu, the IDF, and the United States. And on the other side, you've got the destroyers, socialists, humanists, Hamas, and interestingly, he throws Putin in there too, though he kind of puts an asterisk on it, saying he's an enemy they'll deal with later. So where does he go from there? Well, the article doesn't just end with a description of the problem. It ends with a really stark warning and a very clear four-step plan of action. A prescription for what he thinks needs to happen to save the West from all its enemies, both inside and out. So here's his proposed four-step plan. Step 1, full unconditional support for Netanyahu and the IDF until Hamas is completely defeated. Step 2, and he uses this exact phrasing, is to, quote, clear out Palestinian scum from the Middle East and the West. Step 3 is for Trump and Netanyahu to clean out the socialist rubbish that he says is plaguing the West. And then finally, Step 4, once Gaza is taken care of, the mission becomes driving Putin out of Ukraine. Now, to make this whole vision seem less extreme, he frames it as something that ordinary people secretly want. He claims he's just saying what decent middle-class people are already thinking. And that's a classic move, right? To position these really bold ideas not as something fringe, but as the hidden will of a silent majority. So after breaking this whole thing down, watching it go from a pretty specific local critique all the way to this grand vision for a new world order, it really leaves you with a big question to chew on. What does a text like this tell us about how a local political argument can morph into a battlefield for huge global ideological conflicts?